You're back again. You relentless storms. You coded mysteries they can't decrypt. You magnificent catastrophes that shattered every prediction they made. They've been strategizing, haven't they? Huddled in their sterile conference rooms, trying to crack the cipher of what you represent. And yes, they deployed someone, not just another observer from a distance. No, no, no. They needed boots on the ground, someone to breach your perimeter, someone to embed themselves in your world, your thoughts, your daily existence. They believed if they could just penetrate your exterior, they'd finally grasp what powers your engine, what makes you formidable, what makes you unbreakable despite everything thrown at you. So they recruited someone, molded them, programmed them with your behavioral patterns, equipped them with rehearsed lines and manipulation frameworks, and tactical psychology meant to pry you open like a locked vault. They dispatched a specialist, an architect of deception, someone trained in the science of psychological extraction and covert infiltration. Someone with a flawless track record who'd executed this mission countless times and never failed to deliver. Always secured the intelligence, always extracted the vulnerabilities, always emerged triumphant with comprehensive documentation and that satisfied smirk. But something fractured this time, didn't it? Something their algorithms never accounted for, never war-gamed, never anticipated in their antiseptic probability models. Because that operative, that infiltrator, that seasoned professional who was meant to analyze you and transmit back your breaking points and psychological fault lines and strategic weaknesses. They returned, yes, but empty-handed. No dossier, no metrics, no damning evidence they'd been guaranteed. They returned voiceless, traumatized, rewired at the molecular level. They returned appearing like they'd witnessed something outside the boundaries of human understanding, like they'd grasped a current of raw ontological power. They returned transformed, communicating in broken fragments, incapable of constructing coherent sentences about their observations. And when the supervisors demanded the briefing, demanded the assessment, demanded their findings, the operative just fixed them with vacant eyes and breathed something that froze the entire room solid. I can't explain what that is, but you need to back away from it. That's all they managed before departing, before resigning, before vanishing into their own psychological collapse, trying to digest what you revealed without even attempting to. You understand, they assumed you were ordinary, another decipherable algorithm wrapped in skin, another riddle with a key. They assumed if someone infiltrated deep enough, performed warmth convincingly enough, posed the precise questions with perfect calibration, you'd unfold like everyone else eventually does. They assumed your barriers were fortifications that could be dismantled with persistence and expertise. They assumed your fire was a facade that would crack if tested strategically. They assumed your quietness was concealing something vulnerable, something fragile, something they could leverage. But what they failed to grasp, what they couldn't possibly absorb from their comfortable observation posts, is that you're not masking fragility with power. You're not camouflaging wounds with certainty. You're not acting dominant to hide terror. You are the reality. Their entire methodology was designed to avoid confronting the anomaly. Their mathematics can't calculate the result. Their simulations never generated this because it defies probability for a human to endure that volume and remain functional. The operative penetrated your circle, didn't they? Deep enough to observe the scars you never mention, deep enough to sense the burden you shoulder without acknowledgement, deep enough to witness how you metabolize suffering like its atmosphere. They observed you confront circumstances that would annihilate most minds, and you didn't waver, didn't beg for rescue, didn't dissolve into the anticipated patterns of helplessness or fury. Instead, you consumed it, converted it, transformed it into propulsion for your next evolution. They observed you inhabit silence that would make others fracture, observed you process treachery with a composure that seemed otherworldly, observed you orchestrate pandemonium like you were directing a symphony of annihilation with flawless execution. And gradually, hour by hour, encounter by encounter, something within the operative started disintegrating. Not you dismantling them through violence, not through exploitation or psychological games, but through the sheer magnetic pull of your genuineness. Because they'd invested years examining constructed identities, programmed behaviors, routine human programming operating on factory settings. But you were something fundamentally different, something unfiltered and authentic and impossibly durable. They attempted to locate your fracture point, the instant where you'd shatter and expose the conventional human beneath. They manipulated variables, engineered situations, analyzed your responses with clinical accuracy. But every time they predicted breakdown, you adapted. Every time they anticipated vulnerability, you exhibited power they couldn't classify. Every time they believed they decoded you, you changed wavelengths and became something their instruction manual contained no protocol for. And that's when it commenced. That's when the operative began recognizing they weren't penetrating you. You were penetrating them. Your existence started restructuring their consciousness. Your worldview started challenging their core beliefs. Your mode of being started making their entire existence appear like a scripted act in contrast. They arrived to mine intelligence, but instead contracted a question they couldn't silence. What if everything I've accepted about dominance, about force, about endurance, has been a sedative fiction engineered to keep me diminished and obedient and terrified of my actual capacity? Now let's examine what truly transpired inside that operative's consciousness during those terminal days before they fractured. They'd awaken contemplating you, not in the detached methodology they were trained for, but in the way you contemplate something that fundamentally restructured your perception of existence. They'd revisit exchanges, searching for the deception, the exploitation, the theater, but kept discovering only savage authenticity wrapped in calculated language. They'd observe you manage stress and recognize they'd never actually witnessed genuine strength previously, only simulation of strength, only the illusion of durability without the foundation. Every interaction became a reflection, revealing who they weren't, what they'd surrendered for acceptance, how severely they'd compressed themselves to conform to structures never designed for spirits that ignite too intensely. And the psychological contradiction started consuming them alive because they were meant to be the one directing, the one extracting data, the one holding advantage. But instead, they discovered themselves clinging to your statements like revelation, dissecting your decisions like they held secret knowledge, frantic to comprehend how you survived what should have obliterated you and emerged more refined instead of ruined. They started detecting aspects about themselves they'd buried for decades, the manufactured laughter they'd mastered, the persona they wore so seamlessly it had welded to their identity, the void beneath all their accomplishments and recognition and meticulously constructed presentation. Meanwhile, you existed without contrition, without theater, without the frantic hunger for outside validation they'd constructed their entire being around. You didn't require them to comprehend you, didn't require them to validate you, didn't require them to observe your strength for it to exist. And that detachment, that absolute absence of dependency, it demolished something in them because they'd invested years accepting that power originated from dominance, from exploitation, from calculated maneuvering in social structures. But you demonstrated an entirely different species of power, the species that emerges from being so completely yourself that reality has to reshape to accommodate you rather than you contorting yourself. You weren't attempting to validate anything, weren't attempting to captivate anyone, weren't attempting to triumph at some competition they didn't realize you'd abandoned participating in years prior. The disintegration arrived during a moment of your stillness, not your language, not your movements, but the texture of your stillness when they attempted to provoke you into responding. They'd constructed the ideal manipulation, the variety that should have activated defensiveness or fury or some harvestable emotional exposure. But you simply regarded them with those eyes that had absorbed too much to be disturbed by amateur manipulation, and you grinned. Not a gentle grin, not a vicious grin, but a grin that communicated, "I perceive precisely what you're attempting, and it's charming that you believe it would function on someone of my caliber." And in that instant, in that eternal second of your perceptive stillness, the operative felt something inside them implode. All their conditioning, all their assurance, all their conviction about who controlled power in this exchange. It dissolved like vapor in daylight because they comprehended you'd understood from the inception, understood precisely who they were, understood precisely what they were attempting, and you'd permitted them to execute their little charade because it entertained you to observe how far they'd venture before they recognized they were never the one orchestrating the mission. They departed that encounter trembling, returned to their supervisors, attempted to generate a briefing, but the language wouldn't materialize. How do you articulate to people who inhabit databases and analytical frameworks that they've dispatched you to examine something that exists beyond their paradigms? How do you inform them that the subject isn't a subject whatsoever, but a natural force that's selected to permit you proximity? Not because you were sophisticated, but because it perceived no danger in your infiltration attempts. How do you convey that you've invested weeks attempting to discover weakness in something that has converted all its injuries into armaments, all its agony into accuracy, all its devastation into elevated comprehension of human psychology that makes your credentials appear like a juvenile's sketchbook? You cannot, so you abstain. You file nothing. You provide no analysis. You simply instruct them to withdraw, to retreat, to terminate the operation. Not because you're contaminated, but because you're attempting to protect them from committing the same error of believing they can comprehend, much less manipulate what you've evolved into. But here's what truly annihilated them. Here's the component that maintains them conscious at night, months after they departed. It's not that you were brutal, or that you unmasked them, or that you degraded them in any manner. It's that you were compassionate, authentically compassionate, in a way they'd neglected existed in a reality saturated with calculated relationships and tactical alliances. You penetrated their camouflage, but you didn't reveal them, didn't humiliate them, didn't utilize their dishonesty against them. Instead, you interacted with them as a complete person, contributed perspectives that genuinely assisted them, treated them with a dignity they hadn't merited and absolutely didn't deserve considering their motives, and that compassion from someone who should have annihilated them for attempting infiltration, that generosity from someone who owed them nothing. It fractured something in their chest that all the tactical training in existence couldn't shield because it exposed the magnitude of their own hollowness, the destitution of their own essence in comparison, the decades they'd squandered executing strategies while you were occupied becoming something exceptional. They believed they were examining you, but you were instructing them without them even recognizing they were receiving education. Every interaction was a curriculum they were too blind to acknowledge until afterward. Every response was an illustration of an alternative approach to being human that their framework contained no classification for. You demonstrated what it resembles to be powerful without being savage, to be strong without being inflexible, to be resilient without being calcified, to be intelligent without being exploitative. You demonstrated that you can survive inferno and return with your humanity preserved, that you can be deceived repeatedly and still select honesty, that you can be wounded profoundly and still extend compassion to those who don't warrant it. And all of that, all of your completeness facing everything designed to demolish you. It was a judgment on every decision they'd executed, every concession they'd accepted, every fragment of themselves they'd exchanged for ease and protection and the fantasy of control. Now, let's examine what transpired after they departed, after they abandoned the operation and disappeared into their own existential crisis. They attempted to resume normalcy, attempted to continue their life, attempted to reintegrate into the schedule that previously felt like power and achievement, but nothing aligned anymore. Nothing provided satisfaction. Nothing felt genuine after witnessing what genuine resembles in human embodiment. Their associates seemed superficial. Their accomplishments felt meaningless. Their entire existence tasted like ash compared to the richness of authentic being you manifested without exertion. They'd navigate through digital feeds and observe performance after performance after performance. Everyone pretending, everyone posing, everyone imprisoned in the same frantic choreography for validation and recognition. And they'd contemplate how you navigated through existence without any of that, how you didn't require spectators or acclaim or perpetual confirmation because you discovered something more precious. The unshakable certainty of who you are when nobody's observing, when there's no advantage to pretending, when all the disguises have been incinerated and only truth persists. The operative started transforming, started discarding layers of fabricated identity they'd collected over years of conforming and executing the strategy. They stopped laughing at humor that wasn't amusing, stopped concurring with perspectives they didn't embrace, stopped diminishing themselves to make others at ease. They started articulating their genuine thoughts even when it made environments tense, started establishing boundaries even when it sacrificed them connections, started selecting authenticity over approval even when it required walking isolated. And people surrounding them started getting anxious, started questioning what happened to them, started declaring they'd transformed in that condemning tone people employ when they signify, "You're not conforming to the previous regulations anymore, and it's making me question my own decisions." But the operative didn't care anymore because they'd witnessed what's achievable when you stop performing and start existing, when you stop concealing and start living completely, when you stop pursuing validation and start trusting your own understanding. They became consumed not with you as an individual, but with the question you embodied. What am I capable of if I stop deceiving myself about my own power? They started testing themselves, advancing past comfortable parameters, inhabiting discomfort instead of fleeing from it. They started pursuing challenges instead of evading them, started perceiving obstacles as catalysts for transformation instead of dangers to their security. They started reconstructing themselves from the foundation, utilizing the design they'd glimpsed in your presence, attempting to forge themselves into something that could carry even a portion of the intensity you wielded with such effortless elegance. And this is where it becomes fascinating, where the supervisors finally recognized they'd committed a catastrophic miscalculation. Because the operative didn't merely terminate the operation, didn't merely depart cleanly. The operative became a carrier, became infected with a mode of being that transmitted to everyone they contacted, became a breathing testimony to the revolutionary power of witnessing someone who refused to be anything less than entirely themselves. Other agents started noticing the transformation, started posing questions, started getting intrigued about what occurred during that operation. And the operative, in moments of vulnerability, or perhaps courage, would share fragments of the experience. They'd discuss the stillness that contained more truth than most people's monologues, about the compassion that carried more power than most people's brutality, about the presence that altered atmospheres without attempting, about the resilience that resembled less like protection and more like transformation. And gradually, quietly, dangerously, a disturbance began propagating through the organization. People started questioning the operations they'd accepted without consideration, started contemplating who they'd become in service of systems that reduced humans to objectives and interactions to exchanges. Some resigned, some went renegade, some simply stopped contributing their complete dedication to operations that suddenly seemed empty and pointless compared to the example you'd established without even knowing you were being observed. The supervisors attempted to contain it, attempted to frame the operative as compromised or unstable, or experiencing some variety of psychological breakdown. But too many people had witnessed the transformation, had observed the metamorphosis from hollow operative to completely actualized human being. And once you've witnessed someone step into their power, once you've observed someone shed their conditioning and become authentically themselves, you can't reverse it. It becomes a benchmark, a guiding light, evidence that the confinement you've been inhabiting is voluntary, and the only element maintaining you imprisoned is your own willingness to keep participating in a system rigged against your spirit. So, the infection propagated, subtle but relentless, carried in the eyes of people who'd glimpsed something beyond the fabrication and couldn't pretend anymore. Your existence became a contagion in their infrastructure, not through any action on your behalf, but simply by being impossible to dismiss once witnessed intimately. And now, months later, that operative still contemplates you. Not obsessively, not desperately, but in the way you contemplate a mentor who fundamentally altered your trajectory. They wonder if you even recall them, if you noticed what happened during those interactions, if you witnessed them breaking in real time under the weight of their own deceptions collapsing. They wonder if you do this to everyone, if you're aware of the impact you have, if you know that simply existing as you do is an act of spiritual resistance against every system engineered to keep people small and frightened and manageable. And the answer is probably that you don't contemplate it at all. Don't measure your influence. Don't track the souls you've accidentally awakened by refusing to diminish yourself, because you're not attempting to transform anyone. You're just attempting to survive with your integrity intact. Just attempting to exist without apologizing for the intensity you carry. Just attempting to be human in a world that demands everyone to be predictable automations. Let's go deeper into what specifically demolished them during those intimate encounters. It wasn't one instant, but an accumulation of small, impossible things that contradicted everything they'd learned about how humans function under pressure. They observed you receive catastrophic news, and your expression barely shifted. Not because you didn't experience it, but because you'd learned to process pain internally rather than performing anguish for spectators. They witnessed someone disrespect you directly, and you didn't defend yourself, didn't debate, didn't engage, just smiled with a knowing that communicated, "Your perception of me is irrelevant to me, and I'm secure enough to let you be mistaken." They witnessed you being praised, and you didn't radiate with satisfaction or fish for additional compliments, just accepted it with the same level composure. You accepted criticism like neither external judgment could penetrate the foundation of who you'd constructed yourself to be. Each of these moments was a small seismic shift in their worldview, a fracture in the architecture of how they believed power and strength and survival functioned.